Emily had never had a close relationship with her grandmother. Her mother rarely mentioned the woman who lived in the isolated cottage deep in the woods. It was a distant place, inaccessible to most, and seemed to belong to another world. The news of his grandmother's death came as a shock. Emily barely knew her, and her mother only had a handful of vague stories to tell about the woman who had lived in isolation for years. When it came time to deal with her grandmother's inheritance, Emily felt reluctant, but her mother insisted it was her responsibility, as there were no other living relatives. It was a gray afternoon when Emily turned onto the winding road that led to the cottage. The light rain lashed the car's windshield, and the silence of the forest enveloped her. The house was situated on top of a hill, surrounded by dense forest, as if nature was trying hard to keep it away. When she finally arrived at the house, Emily was surprised by its decrepit appearance. The wood was worn and peeling, the windows dusty and lifeless. It was as if the house had been forgotten by time. Emily wondered how her grandmother had managed to live there alone. As she entered the house, a musty smell hit her. The interior was gloomy, with furniture covered in sheets and cobwebs hanging in the corners. She felt a shiver down her spine and a feeling that she was being watched. That house had a heavy and gloomy atmosphere. Emily began exploring the dusty rooms, finding antiques and old mementos of her grandmother. But what intrigued her most was a collection of old dolls. Each one looked more sinister than the last, with glass eyes that seemed to follow your movements. She tried not to think about it too much and continued exploring. In her grandmother's room, Emily found a photograph of the woman when she was young. She looked stunning, with lively eyes and a radiant smile. Emily wondered what had happened to make her grandmother become the enigmatic woman who had lived in that isolated house. While exploring the house, Emily felt a strange presence. It felt like something was watching her, something that couldn't be seen. The feeling of being watched made her nervous, but she tried to ignore it. In the dusty attic, Emily found one last doll, different from all the others. It was a perfect replica of her grandmother when she was young. The resemblance was surprising. From the details of the dress to the facial expression, Emily felt a shiver when she picked up the doll. It was as if the doll's eyes were staring at her, as if she were looking at her grandmother in her youth. That night, Emily went to bed in her grandmother's room, with the doll on the nightstand next to her. As he tried to sleep, he felt something was wrong. Her grandmother's doll seemed to follow her with its eyes. Emily tried to ignore the feeling, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong with that doll. In the middle of the night, Emily woke up to a soft sound, like a whisper. She turned on the light and saw her grandmother's doll in a different position than she had left it. The doll's eyes were still staring at her, but they had moved. Emily was paralyzed with fear, her heart racing. It was just her imagination, she thought. The house was full of strange noises, and the darkness of the night could deceive the senses. Emily tried to convince herself of this and turned off the light, but the feeling that something was wrong prevented her from going back to sleep. It was then that her grandmother's doll moved again, this time with a soft squeak. Emily watched in horror as the doll's eyes slowly moved, as if the doll was watching her every move. Her heart raced, and fear overwhelmed her. In the darkness, his grandmother's doll's eyes seemed to shine with a dark light. Emily wondered if she was going crazy or if something terrible was happening. That doll was alive, and Emily knew she would have to face the terrible truth behind this mysterious inheritance. Her grandmother's doll, a perfect replica of the woman in her youth, was more than it seemed. It was an artifact from a dark and sinister past, and Emily was about to uncover the terrifying secrets surrounding that inheritance. The morning after the disturbing night, her grandmother's doll seemed to come to life. Emily was determined to find a logical explanation for what had happened. She knew she couldn't just accept that a doll was able to move on its own. However, the feeling that something was terribly wrong with the doll did not leave her. Emily decided to begin her investigation by examining the doll closely. She picked it up carefully, feeling its weight and examining every detail. The resemblance to her grandmother in her youth was striking. The doll's glass eyes were its most intriguing feature. They seemed to be watching her intently, and it wasn't an optical illusion. As Emily examined the doll, a terrifying thought crossed her mind. She wondered if the doll could be a vessel of sorts, containing something sinister. Perhaps your grandmother had used black magic or some kind of spell to trap a soul or entity in the doll. It was an absurd idea, but it seemed to be the only explanation for the doll's strange behavior. Emily decided to search for information about her grandmother and her possible hidden activities. She began searching the house looking for diaries, records, or anything that could shed light on her grandmother's past. As he searched the dusty rooms, he found an old chest hidden in the basement. Inside the trunk, Emily found a series of diaries written by her grandmother. As she read the notes, she was shocked by what she discovered. His grandmother was, in fact, a practitioner of black magic. She had performed rituals and spells to communicate with the afterlife, believing she could obtain supernatural knowledge and power. The records described the use of the doll, which was called Vesela in her grandmother's rituals. The doll served as a receptacle for supernatural entities, allowing them to temporarily manifest themselves in the world of the living. Emily was horrified to realize that the doll, the same one that was now in her hands, was used in dark rituals by her grandmother. The revelation left her terrified. She could not believe that the doll she held in her hands was a receptacle for supernatural entities, as described in her grandmother's diaries. But the feeling that something was wrong with the doll only grew, and Emily knew she couldn't just ignore the truth she had discovered. That night, Emily decided she needed to confront the doll. She took her to her grandmother's room and began asking questions, as if hoping to get answers from the doll. To his surprise, something strange happened. The doll's glass eyes began to move, as if following the movement of her hand. Emily was terrified, but also determined to find out what was going on. She continued to ask the doll questions, and the doll's eyes responded by moving to indicate yes or no. It was as if the doll was trying to communicate with her in some way. While Emily was talking to the doll, she felt a strange presence in the room. It was as if something invisible was hovering around her, watching her. She knew she wasn't alone in that room, and the feeling of fear enveloped her. It was then that the doll began to whisper, uttering unintelligible words. The whisper was soft and unsettling, as if the doll was trying to tell a story. Emily became increasingly convinced that the doll was somehow connected to supernatural entities. In a moment of courage and desperation, Emily asked the doll what she wanted. The doll's eyes moved slowly, indicating the word help. It was as if the doll was begging for something. That night was the scariest night Emily had ever experienced. She was in the dark, alone with a doll that appeared to be a receptacle for supernatural entities. The feeling that something was wrong with the doll was overwhelming, and Emily knew she would have to face the terrible truth that was before her. Your grandmother's doll was more than just an object. It was a connection to the supernatural world, and Emily was about to find out what that meant. The discovery that her grandmother's doll was somehow a vessel for supernatural entities left Emily in a state of bewilderment and fear. The feeling that something was terribly wrong with the doll was overwhelming, but Emily knew she could no longer ignore the truth in front of her. The next morning, Emily decided to seek out more information about the doll's history and her grandmother's practice of black magic. She continued to read her grandmother's diaries, looking for any clues that would help her understand what was happening. As she flipped through the old pages, Emily discovered that her grandmother used to perform secret rituals in the house, especially in the basement. The idea of exploring the dark basement was terrifying, but Emily knew it was the only way to discover the truth behind the living doll. She decided it was time to face her fears and investigate the place where her grandmother had performed her sinister rituals. Descending the dusty stairs that led to the basement, Emily felt a change in the atmosphere. The air was colder and heavier, and the darkness was almost tangible. The dim light of a flashlight revealed a room filled with strange objects and mysterious symbols drawn on the floor. The basement seemed to be the scene of dark and unknown rituals. In the far corner of the basement, Emily found a wooden table covered with a dark cloth. Carefully, she lifted the cloth and revealed a collection of strange objects, including candles, incense, and amulets. But what caught his attention the most was an old, dusty book. The title of the book was written in a foreign language, and upon opening it, Emily realized that it was a grimoire of black magic. While flipping through the pages of the grimoire, Emily discovered that her grandmother had engaged in dark rituals to summon supernatural entities. She believed that by doing so, she could gain mysterious knowledge and powers. The rituals involved sacrifices and offerings, and the entities invoked were described as dark beings thirsty for human souls. Emily was horrified by her grandmother's practices and the disturbing revelations she found in the grimoire. She began to suspect that her grandmother's doll was, in fact, a vessel for one of these supernatural entities. The doll seemed to be begging for help the night before, as if it was trapped and needed to be freed. Determined to unravel the mystery and break the possible link between the doll and the entity, Emily decided to seek help from a local occultist. She knew she couldn't face this situation alone and needed someone with knowledge of magic and supernatural rituals. The occultist agreed to meet Emily at her grandmother's house and, upon examining the doll and grimoire, confirmed his suspicions. He explained that the doll was, in fact, a vessel for a supernatural entity, and the only way to free it was to perform an exorcism ritual. However, the ritual would not be simple or risk-free. They would have to face the entity that was linked to the doll, a dangerous and unpredictable task. The occultist warned Emily that the process could attract the entity's wrath, and they should be prepared to face the challenges that would arise. That night, Emily, the occultist, and her grandmother's doll gathered in the basement, where dark rituals had taken place in the past. The occultist began reciting ancient words of exorcism, and the room became filled with a sinister energy. The candles around the doll began to flicker, and an icy wind swept through the basement. Her grandmother's doll began to twitch and shake, emitting terrifying moans. It looked like the entity was struggling to free itself. Emily felt an indescribable fear, but she couldn't back down now. She held the occultist's hand, and together they continued the ritual. As the ritual progressed, the entity inside the doll began to manifest. Dark shadows twisted around him, and a howl of agony echoed in the basement. It appeared that the entity did not want it to be released, but Emily was determined to complete the exorcism. Finally, with a shrill scream, the entity was expelled from the doll and disappeared into the darkness. Her grandmother's doll stood still, and the room returned to silence. The occultist confirmed that the entity had been banished, and the doll was now free from its evil influence. A sense of relief and triumph filled Emily, but she knew that the experience would haunt her for the rest of her life. She had learned that the world of the occult and the supernatural was real, and that evil could take many forms, even that of a seemingly harmless doll. With her grandmother's doll finally freed, Emily felt she had done her duty and broken the curse that had haunted her. However, the experience would leave her with a terrifying memory of that mysterious heritage. With the evil entity finally exorcised from her grandmother's doll, Emily felt immense relief. The feeling that something was terribly wrong was gone, and the atmosphere in her grandmother's house seemed lighter. However, the experience had left her with deep emotional scars. Emily knew she couldn't just leave her grandmother's doll in the house. She was a constant reminder of her grandmother's dark legacy and the dark magic practices that had taken place there. He decided to bury the doll in a remote location in the forest, far from anyone, hoping that no one would ever find it. Along with the occultist, Emily went into the forest that night, carrying the doll with her. The darkness of the forest was oppressive, but Emily was determined to get rid of the doll once and for all. They found a secluded spot and began the burial process. As they dug a deep hole, Emily couldn't help but think about her grandmother and the dark choices she had made in life. She wondered if her grandmother was aware of the consequences of her actions, or if she had been deceived by the supernatural entities she had tried to communicate with. When the hole was ready, Emily placed her grandmother's doll in the bottom and covered it with dirt. As he did so, he felt a strange sensation, as if the doll was resisting its fate. But Emily was determined not to allow the doll to continue to haunt her or anyone else. After burying the doll, Emily and the occultist performed one last ritual to seal the place and protect it from evil influences. Emily knew that the darkness that had permeated her grandmother and the doll was a force that could not be underestimated, and it was important to ensure that no one else was affected by it. Upon returning to her grandmother's house, Emily knew that this would be the last time she would set foot in that dark place. She was determined to leave the past behind and move on with her life. The experience had left her with a dark understanding of the world of the occult and the supernatural, but she was determined not to let it define her. Months have passed since that incident, and Emily has tried to return to a normal life. She distanced herself from her grandmother's house and never spoke again about the doll or the dark rituals she had discovered. However, memories of that experience continued to haunt her, and she became more skeptical of the world of the unknown. Her grandmother's dark legacy still haunted her, but Emily knew it was her responsibility to ensure it wasn't passed on to future generations. She learned that evil could take many forms, even that of a harmless doll, and that the occult world was a place filled with mystery and danger. As Emily moved on with her life, she became more wary of the unknown, knowing that horror could lurk in the shadows. She became a keeper of her grandmother's dark secret, determined to ensure that no one else fell into the clutches of the supernatural as she had. The story of her grandmother's doll became a haunting memory, a horror story she would never forget. Emily knew that there were horror stories and creepypastas circulating around the world, but she had experienced the horror in the flesh, and that experience would stay with her for the rest of her life. However, she was determined to overcome the fear and darkness that had manifested themselves in that mysterious heritage, and writing their own story of overcoming and redemption.